I could ask for a moment of silence for the 29 mass shootings that occurred this month in the United States. We are Senate leaders. What are we doing?
This is not, it should not be a partisan issue. This is an American issue. It will save lives, American lives, and we have to act.
After 2 mass shootings and 18 people dead, the White House says President Biden is considering executive action on gun control, while the U.S. Senate weighs the prospects of expanding background checks amid increasing pressure to enact meaningful measures. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. President Biden is facing mounting pressure to address an all too familiar issue that continues to plague the United States: gun violence. 2 deadly mass shootings this month, one at a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado that left 10 people dead, and the other at 3 spas in Atlanta, Georgia that killed 8. According to the Gun Violence Archive, 117 mass shootings have occurred in 29 states and Washington, D.C. so far this year. It's a significant rise compared to last year, 66 mass shootings recorded by March 2020. And since 2014, there have been 2,805 mass shootings across the U.S. Earlier this month, Democrats tabled 2 bills adopted by the House of Representatives to expand background checks, including private transactions between unlicensed individuals, and close a loophole that allows gun sales after 3 business days, even if the background check isn't complete. Now, according to a recent poll, 61% of Americans want the Senate to pass the House bills. While 2 key senators expressed optimism that Congress could reach a deal on expanding background checks, they warned that the legislations passed by the House are a non-starter in the Senate among Republicans and even some Democrats.
The bill that passed the House, that doesn't even have 50 votes in the Senate. You're not going to get to 60 votes with legislation that requires when a father wants to sell his gun to his son to have to get a background check. My focus has always been make it more difficult for people that we all agree shouldn't have firearms, make it more difficult for them to get firearms. That is violent criminals, the dangerously mentally ill.
Attempts over the last 2 decades to pass gun control legislation have failed in the Senate. Background check expansions and assault rifle bans failed in 2013. A universal background check and a ban on suspected terrorists buying guns failed in 2015, and tighter background checks also failed in 2016. But with growing support among Americans, will the Senate finally pass new gun legislation? I'm joined by Allen West, chairman of the Republican Party of Texas. He's also a former congressman and board member of the National Rifle Association, the NRA. Congressman West, there are dozens of measures being filed in Texas. Some would restrict assault weapons, others would make it easier for Texans to carry guns. Now, some gun control and safety advocates say, as you know, that in the wake of the recent mass shootings, it is insensitive for Republican legislators to push for looser gun laws when most Americans want to see something done to stop mass shootings. Why then is the Republican Party seemingly still operating in its own reality, its own bubble?
And first and foremost, let's look at what happened in Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, Colorado has some of the most stringent gun control laws in the United States of America, that city itself. And furthermore, that grocery store, which is part of the Kroger chain, has a rule that no one can enter into that grocery store with a firearm. So when you talk about these gun control measures that were already in place, gun control does not affect anybody that is a law-abiding legal gun owner.
But as you know, Congressman, though, just a few days before that grocery store shooting in Colorado, a state court had overturned a ban on assault weapons. And we know that the shooter was carrying an assault weapon, wasn't he, in that shooting?
When we talk about assault weapons, anything that I use to bring bodily harm against a person is considered an assault weapon. If I were to take a hammer, if I were to take a knife, And so I think that we have this misnomer out there that, I own, semi-automatic rifles, and the semi-automatic rifles that I have are sitting in my home. So why would you punish me as a legal law-abiding gun owner who have done nothing wrong? And let's look at the case in point, what happened at the Sutherland Springs church shooting here in Texas, where you had an individual who illegally purchased an AR-15 weapon and went into that church there in Sutherland Springs and murdered many of the congregants there. And guess who was able to stop them? It was a legal, law-abiding firearms instructor certified by the National Rifle Association with an AR-15 himself. So if you want to talk about this whole thing of gun control, who are you really controlling? Because you're never going to control the criminal element or the element that is out there acquiring firearms illegally.
But Congressman, as you know, 20,000 Americans were killed by guns last year alone. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. It isn't a partisan issue. A 2019 poll by American Public Media, in fact, found that 8 in 10 people, including 7 in 10 Republicans, support gun safety legislation. Aren't you and other GOP leaders in your state going against what the majority of voters, including Republicans, want, which is more gun safety?
No, I'm not going against what people want. As a matter of fact, here in the state of Texas, the people in the state of Texas want constitutional carry, which abides by the Constitution. And again, look at how many people die of car accidents a year. Are we going to start banning automobiles? So I think what we need to do is focus on the individuals that are committing these acts. And when you start talking about the people that die because of gun violence, how many people die because of suicides? How many people have lost their lives because of gang violence?
And a lot of these suicides are related to guns being in the hands of the wrong people. Are you for expanded background checks?
We have these background checks in place. I think the problem that we have is that how do we make sure that criminals are not getting these weapons? How do we make sure that we process and charge these criminals with unlawful gun possession, which is something that we don't see happening in the United States of America. So what we do is we try to have the low-hanging fruit of going after legal, law-abiding gun owners. So when I look at H.R. 8, I look at H.R. 127, I look at H.R. 130, they don't do anything to solve the issue. What they do is they penalize and punish legal, law-abiding gun owners.
But let me ask you this again, Congressman, as someone who served in Afghanistan and in Iraq, is there any reason why an American living in a crowded city should have an AR-15?
So who makes the decision what I can and cannot have? Because I do have several AR-15s and I take them out. I still enjoy going out and doing target shooting. My friends invite me out to go out and do hog hunting. Now, I live in the Dallas metropolitan.
But you've been trained to use them. You've been trained to use them. Most people haven't been.
Well, that's one of the things that the National Rifle Association deals with is proper training of individuals when they do purchase these firearms. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things you see out there is that most people are, pushing for training of individuals. You don't just see a person that goes out and get a firearm and they go downtown and they start shooting or what have you. We're talking about responsible gun owners. But when you deal with the issue of mental illness, when you deal with the issue of making sure that people like Jared Loughner, who shot my former colleague out in Arizona, or the person in Colorado who went out into the theater there. Their history of mental illness was known, and that should have been reported. That should have been in a database. So again, you're talking to a person that has owned firearms and has purchased firearms, and I don't understand why I need to be told that I cannot have something that the Constitution gives me a right to own.
Let me ask you this about another Republican in your home state. The governor, Greg Abbott, has been trying to block Texas from federal gun regulation through legislation that could make Texas, quote, a Second Amendment sanctuary state. Here's what the governor wrote. He said, Texas is working this session to erect a complete barrier against any government official anywhere from treading on gun rights in Texas. The Lone Star State must be a Second Amendment sanctuary state. Just a day after the Colorado shooting, Governor Abbott told a gathering of Texas young Republicans, they're going to come to get your guns. Now, isn't this all carefully cultivated political hysteria?
No, it's not.
By some Republicans designed to keep the gun lobby and the Republican base happy?
No, it's not. Because when you look at the former Democrat presidential candidate, Robert Francis O'Rourke, a former member of the United States Congress, I believe he stood up on a stage and said, hell yes, we're coming for your guns. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Should I not believe in him, or should I not believe the legislation that I see? Like I said, H.R. 8, H.R. 127, H.R. 30. Should I not believe history? Because in recent times, we saw that one of the first things that Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela was he ended private gun ownership. And history has also shown us that in Nazi Germany, in communist China, and other places. So I think there's a reason for concern.
But Congressman, history has also shown us that countries that have banned assault weapons don't have the mass shootings that are epidemic to the United States.
No, they just kill people in another way. They just use knives,
which
is one of the problems they have in England.
Just compare Canada and the United States. The gun death rate in the US is 9 times as high as Canada.
I don't want to be Canadian.
All right, but what should be done as an American to stop these mass shootings? Clearly, something needs to be done without this slippery slope argument that Republicans always use.
Well, it's not a slippery slope argument. It's a constitutional argument. And so if you want to deal with the issue, deal with the criminal element that is out there getting guns illegally. They're not going through background checks. If you want to deal with this issue, deal with the issue of mental illness. The Second Amendment is a right that every American has. And so I guess we need to look at reforming our freedom of speech right, our freedom of assembly, maybe even our freedom of religion, which we saw was violated in this COVID issue when we had elected officials shutting down churches. So we have to be very careful about the assaults on our constitutional rights. And that's why the Founding Fathers created those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They call them the Bill of Rights.
All right, former Congressman Allen West, chairman of the Republican Party of Texas, thank you very much indeed for being with us.
My pleasure, Ghida. Thank you.
Now, the debate over widespread and comprehensive gun control legislation in the US has gone unresolved for many years, both at the federal and state levels. As a result, some cities with high rates of gun crime have had to come up with creative ways to fix the problem. One of them is the city of Richmond in California, once considered one of the nation's 10 most violent cities. Its current mayor, Tom Butt, an advocate for gun control, became an early supporter of a local anti-violence strategy when he was the city's councilman in 2007. The goal was to focus on the people who use guns rather than the guns themselves. As a result, in 2013, Richmond saw the lowest number of annual homicides in 3 decades. To tell us more about the impact of the program on gun violence in his city, Tom Butt, Mayor of Richmond, California, joins me now. Mayor Butt, the issue of gun violence often leads to a heated debate here in the United States. We just heard how some Republican officials look at this. How do you, as a gun safety advocate, as a Democrat in a city that was ranked one of the most violent cities in the United States not so long ago, break the deadlock at the federal level in the US Senate to pass gun safety legislation?
Well, in California, local gun laws are preempted by state law. So we really cannot regulate firearms at all in California on a local level. And of course, a lot of state legislation is preempted by federal legislation and by court constitutional things. So what we focused on is not trying to regulate guns, but trying to address gun violence. We started a program called the Office of Neighborhood Safety, and it's called other things in other cities. But the idea was that we put together a group of street smart mentors, many of whom had served time in San Quentin and state penitentiary, and their job was to identify those handful of people in Richmond who are most likely, again, to be perpetrators or victims of gun violence, and then try to turn their life around. And it's been a very, very successful program.
And I believe that almost 80%, in fact, I think it's 78% of the people in this program get the counseling they need. Obviously, there are long-term benefits to giving people counseling, but can you really ignore the weapons themselves and just focus on the socioeconomic aspects surrounding this, giving better mental health, education, housing to those who need it? Don't you also need to make sure they don't have easy access to weapons, including assault rifles, which can also, as we know, all too often accidentally get into the wrong hands?
Of course, part of the program is to separate these individuals from guns. And as you said, it's a it's a multifaceted program. It includes trying to get people into educational programs, trying to get them jobs. A lot of these individuals have been in the criminal justice system for one reason or another. They've lost their driver's license, so getting them back into the mainstream of society is that's the overriding objective.
You mentioned, Mayor, earlier the so-called preemption laws. We know that most Americans live in cities. Most people who die in shooting incidents die in cities, so support for gun regulation in cities, unsurprisingly, is relatively high. Should state laws be revised to give local officials more authority?
I think that even without preemption, there's a limited amount that cities can do. I mean, theoretically, if our city could outlaw guns totally, somebody can bring a gun in from the next city. So this is something we have to do nationally, have to do on a statewide level if it's going to be effective.
All right, Mayor Tom Butt, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Appreciate it. Last week, in the wake of the recent mass shootings in Colorado and Atlanta, President Biden was asked at his first press conference since taking office what were his administration's plans for tightening gun legislation. This was his response.
Successful presidents, better than me, have been successful in large part because they know how to time what they're doing, order it, decide in priorities what needs to be done. The next major initiative is, and I'll be announcing it Friday in Pittsburgh in detail, is to rebuild the infrastructure, both physical and technological infrastructure of this country.
Biden's answer drew some criticism from supporters of gun control who were disappointed in what they saw as a shift in tone from candidate Biden, who promised on his first day in office to send a bill to Congress that would close background check loopholes, something he has yet to do more than 70 days into his presidency. To discuss Biden's response and what Democrats in Congress can do to pass meaningful legislation, I'm joined by Fred Guttenberg, whose daughter Jamie was killed in the tragic mass shooting in Parkland High School in Florida in 2018. He is the founder of Orange Ribbons for Gun Safety and the author of Find the Helpers, a book about overcoming grief. Mr. Guttenberg, I'm very sorry about your tragic loss. Every time there is a mass shooting, there is anger, there's despair, but there's also renewed hope that this time it will lead to real change, that things will be different, but seemingly it never is the case. It's a painful, ongoing ritual. When you hear politicians here in the US, when you hear President Biden at his press conference just the other day, completely sidestep a question on gun legislation, what goes through your mind beyond the indignation that you tweeted about? What would you have liked to hear him say?
Well, first, in spite of all this, I do have hope, because in cities and states across this country, gun safety is passing. And in the past two elections, Americans have voted, and they've voted for gun safety. Regarding the press conference the other day, I wouldn't say he sidestepped it. The truth is, the very first minute of that answer actually was exactly what I wanted to hear, which is everything is on the table, even executive action. And through the press conference, it seemed he was saying he's going to be strategic. He understands how the filibuster is a roadblock, and he's willing to put that on the table. That was important. I was disappointed when he pivoted to something else instead of continuing to discuss what he might do. But I do know him, and I am optimistic in his desire to do something about this. I am disappointed at the pivot in the press conference, but I do take him at his word that everything, including executive actions, are on the table.
But why has he been so reluctant so far to do anything about this, including take executive action? There's been a whole host of executive orders signed early on, none on gun control. What will it take?
Well, and listen, so my message to everybody working on this has been, for his first couple months, priorities 1 through 10 were COVID, anything to do with COVID. However, it is now time to get to work on these other things. And I will tell you, the reluctance to really jump into this, it needs to come to an end. This is the year that we need to pass gun safety in America. This is the year. You know, next year we go to another election year, and who knows what happens in an election year. This is the year. Too many people are dying. Mass shootings are not going away. Everyday shootings are not going away. I personally, as someone who lost his daughter to gun violence, I am not against the Second Amendment. That was always the big lie. Legal, lawful gun owners, they don't pay any attention to gun safety measures because no effect on them. But we as a country need to recognize there's too many weapons on the streets and they're being used to kill people we love, and we need to do something about it. And this is the year that we will.
But what makes you think that this is indeed the year?
So here's why I believe this is the year. In 2018 and 2020, we had 2 massive elections. Americans voted, and this issue flipped a lot of seats. When people vote, legislators listen. Listen, this version of the current Republican Party is not going to go along with anything. But there are lots of Republicans, Republican gun owners in this country who support gun safety. You know, the former governor of Ohio, John Kasich, the current governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, the governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, they all favor gun safety. So there are plenty of Republicans who want to save lives as well. They're not currently sitting in the House and the Senate. And because of that, the House is in a position to move forward and pass and move legislation forward. The Senate, I think the Democrats who are now in charge need to decide they're going to go forward without a filibuster. And that will get legislation through the Senate. You have the current version of the Republican Party in the Senate is not going to do this. They won't.
The school shooting in which your daughter tragically was killed involved a 19-year-old who purchased a weapon legally, an AR-15, to kill 17 people and wound 17 others. He purchased his weapon legally. He passed a background check. How do you fix a system then that allows this huge crack in it at a time when mental health claims for children between the ages of 13 and 18 has doubled over the same period last year, if you make a quick comparison?
So 3 weeks after he murdered my daughter and 16 others, we passed legislation in Florida. We raised the purchase age to 21, and we instituted red flag laws. Had that legislation been in place, he wouldn't have been able to buy his weapon. So there is so much we can do. Listen, I want to look at gun safety in a public health way, not one that's going to further divide, but one that's going to encourage people to work together to save lives. So we need to ask the question, how do we lower the gun violence death rate? How do we decrease the instances of gun violence in America? How do we decrease the severity of gun violence injuries when they happen? Because the truth is, there are hundreds of millions of weapons already here on the streets. We need to deal with the reality that we have to take steps to address that fact. Maybe it's also by tackling ammunition and having background checks on ammunition. But there is so much we can do to start saving lives. And I am going to again say what I keep saying. If the Democrats in the Senate start going forward and working to do this without any Republican help, then what you will end up seeing is some of the Republicans on the fence joining them. This can be bipartisan, but they also do have to be strong and strategic, and they have to do it this year.
All right, Fred Guttenberg, thank you so much for being with us and for helping us better understand this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
The right to bear arms is holy to the vast majority of Americans. It is enshrined in the US Constitution. And the debate, which has for decades been a tug of war between two Americas, is hardly new. But what is newer in a country with the highest gun ownership per capita by far is that the recurrence of mass shootings is moving public opinion. But one class of legislator, mostly within the Republican Party, is not listening. What is also new is that with the rise of right-wing, white supremacy groups, the danger of gun violence is going beyond criminality and suicide. Gun sales surged last year after the Black Lives Matter protest erupted across the US, with about 8.5 million first-time gun buyers, with African Americans for the first time representing the biggest increase in any demographic group. And so in short, while America's infatuation with firearms may be shifting, more than the sheer number of privately held firearms, it is the pernicious and deadly gun culture that needs to change. And when you know that in some shooting incidents, 1 or 2 US police officers have used more bullets than rounds fired in an entire year by the entire police force of Germany, with a population of 80 million, it becomes clear that the gun violence debate in the US makes up in emotion what it lacks in substance. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, for this week. From the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.